Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, I'm continuing my trek through the era of films known as the Disney Renaissance. Now we are on the third entry, a film that I have reviewed in the past. And it is not only one of my favorite films from this era of Disney's creations, but it's also one of my favorite Disney films in general. This is, of course, Beauty and the Beast. This is, of course, directed by Gary Trousdale and Kirk, who as a team after this would direct another one of my favorite films from both eras. That's Hunchback of Notre Dame, and of course a film I have not seen yet, which is Atlantis: The Lost Empire. And music once again by Alan Menken and Howard Ashman, which this is the last thing Ashman would work on before he sadly passed away from AIDS complications, which is why this film has a little immemorial thing to him that reads, "To our friend Howard, who gave a mermaid her voice and a beast his soul." And with a screenplay by Linda Woolverton, which, just a little side, she is the credited screenplay person, but the story was actually done by multiple people. There's too many people for me to list, but she's the one that did the screenplay. And she also did the screenplay for Homeward Bound, The Incredible Journey, The Lion King, both of Burton's Alice in Wonderland films, and of course both Maleficent films, so quite the pedigree there with Disney. And the voice cast, we got Paige O'Hara as Belle, Robbie Benson as the Beast, Richard White as Gaston, the legendary late Jerry Orbach as Lumiere, David Sturz as Cogsworth, the late and also legendary Angela Lansbury as Mrs. Potts, Bradley Pierce as Chip, Rex Everhart as Maurice, and Jesse Cordy as LeFou. Like The Little Mermaid, this is a film that Disney had attempted to make multiple times in the past, once in the 30s, once in the 50s, but they gave up on them for various reasons, mainly because they proved to be a challenge for the story team. And Disney himself might have been discouraged because in '46, the French director Jean Cocteau released his own version, which, if you look at that version and look at the final version, you can see that that did end up influencing the story a little bit, even though that one's probably a little closer to the original Beauty and the Beast story, or at least the most well-known version. 1987 is when they revisited the project, which, when you look at the timeline of the films being made, lines up. This would have been when Little Mermaid was well into production, and they're like, oh yeah, we'll do another one. We'll give this attempt another try. So they set it up originally for the satellite studio they created in London to help with the animation for Who Framed Roger Rabbit, because they figure, oh well, these people need to work. And Richard Purdom was originally hired as the director. He was a supervising animator later on Hercules, and he was a key assistant animator on Space Jam. Now, one of the things that came up while he was still in charge of production was that this was going to be the first animated film to use a screenwriter. Now, some people are going to go, and? Well, that's because at the time, and I don't know how much of this is still true nowadays, usually with an animated film, the story developed from the storyboards, and then they went and did the script. Instead here, Wolverton wrote the original draft, and then they did the storyboards. Now, the original draft is still different. How much, without reading that draft, I can't say, but it was different enough to the point where Katzenberg, name been brought up before, name we're going to bring up a couple more times here, in 1989, was dissatisfied with the pitch, and he ordered it scrapped and started from scratch. And because of this, Purdom decided to resign as director, and then of course our final directors were hired, and at this point they also decided to turn the film into a musical, which I think definitely was a choice for the better, because it's hard to imagine this film working without the musical numbers. And this is also when they added other characters in, such as the side characters, the enchanted objects, and they added a true villain in Gaston, because before that, the pictures didn't have a villain. And it's also kind of hard to imagine this film working without Gaston as the villain, or having any villain. It'd just be by the numbers, I guess. And of course, 1990, Katzenberg approved the revised idea, they resumed the storyboards, and they went into production. Now, if you've heard those years right, you can see that this is a pretty quick production history, which is another thing to note, because normally for animated films of this scope, production takes about 4 years. And then when you look at, like, even nowadays, how quickly they release their animated films, you can see production being that long is still the norm. They did it in 2 years. Which, looking at the final film, there might be a couple places where you could say they kind of cut corners with the animation, with maybe the side characters, but for the most part, the big scenes, they're animated excellently. So you can see that 2 years they spent it well. Of course, near the end, you can kind of see where they also reused animation, which this is the first time I actually noticed that, but I went in looking for it. And part of the reason I think for the quick turnaround is also that they use the same CAPS digital compositing system they developed when they were doing the Rescuers Down Under. So they already had that developed, so they were able to use the quick turnaround with it. But then they also utilize CGI in this film. It's mainly for backgrounds. Like the main shot that people think of and that comes to mind is during the ballroom dance. And it's during the big shot where it twists and turns before going up to the ceiling. And now part of that is that it creates the illusion of a dollying effect. And it also makes a wonderful sweeping shot. When you look at that, you're like, this is one of the reasons animation exists. You look at that and you look at the opening scene of the Rescuers Down Under and you're like, this is why animation is an excellent art form. Now, in 1991, a work-in-progress cut was shown at the New York Film Festival on September 29th. Now, 70% of the film was completed, and the rest of it was filled in with storyboards and sketches, you know, along with maybe some rough animation and, of course, the voice work. Even with that, the film, people loved it, and it received a 10-minute standing ovation. Now, just for curiosity's sake, I would love to actually see this cut of the film just to see what parts were not completed at that point and see how it plays with it. But it just shows that even if the film's not completed, if it's a well-made film, people are going to love it regardless. And of course, film came out, and it's roughly considered a classic. I mean, I usually going to wait to the end, but here's what Rotten Tomatoes synopsis of the film is. Enchanting, sweepingly romantic, and featuring plenty of wonderful musical numbers, Beauty and the Beast is one of Disney's most elegant animated offerings, which I have to agree. And while I might not always agree with Ebert, here's what he had to say on it. Beauty and the Beast reaches back to an older and healthier Hollywood tradition in which the best writers, musicians, and filmmakers are gathered for a project on the assumption that a family audience deserves great entertainment too. That is true. I think he's trying to do like a minor shot there while praising the film, but to go back with that, this film also harkens back to some of the films of the Golden and Silver Age of Disney, as I established in the prelude. Kind of like how Little Mermaid does, but I'd say it takes it a step further, takes how they updated that formula and fully refines it. Which, that's one thing I can definitely say that you could see when you're watching these films in sequence, you could see that they took what they established previously and made it better. Because, like I mentioned when I reviewed Little Mermaid, like Ariel, like the villain, if there's any weakness, it might be a little bit with the romance, but that's because Prince Eric, there's not really a lot of depth to his character. But there's enough there, spurred on by his vocal performance, that you do root for him. You root for him definitely more than some of the princes from the Golden and Silver Age, because there's more to his character. Here they continue that further. And of course the romance is even more believable. Now, before I get into that, I know in recent years there's been the whole thing about, oh, Belle and the Beast relationship is Stockholm Syndrome. I think most of the people who say that don't really understand what Stockholm Syndrome is. For it to be Stockholm Syndrome, Belle would have to be falling in love with the Beast without him changing. Also him gaslighting and brainwashing her. None of that is there. Makes for a nice one-note joke, but it's not true, and I feel that anyone that actually does a legit analysis of this film and actually gives that thing some weight is, I don't really like using this term a lot, but they just don't get the film. If they're legitimately throwing that on there. Now, one thing about this film is, of course, it has a very strong female lead character. Now, modern days, a lot of films are trying to do that. The reason I say try is because there's varying success. Some projects they work, some projects they don't. With this one, this is probably an instance of that one joke that's been going on around a little bit is that Disney seemed to be more inclusive with their characters when they weren't trying to be. Which, yeah. But I think it's that they weren't obviously trying to be, because this is a quote from our screenwriter about the character of Belle. And this is the kind of archetype she goes into. She's a strong character without it being overbearing or making you feel like, eh. This is what she had to say. A strong female character means somebody who is proactive in their world, who affects their world, isn't a victim, even victimized by it, or if they are victimized by it, they take action to change that for themselves. They look at the world in interesting ways, maybe another way than the culture does. That makes a strong woman if she's vocal about it, or even goes about trying to make changes without being vocal about it. There are so many interesting ways to describe women besides just strong, even this pure difficult strength. It's strong-willed. Strong-willed is definitely a way to describe Belle in this film. She definitely has her own opinions. She loves reading. And she's not going to put up with crap from a misogynist like Gaston. And she definitely is someone who lives in the world of the town, but she wants more, as her song points out. She definitely is a strong character, but like I mentioned, there's nothing about it that you're like, eh. And of course, since it's a film I watched as a kid, I never really saw anything wrong with her. With that, and part of that I think is because the grandmother that raised me was a strong woman, and the other grandmother that helped was also a strong woman. So it's one of those things that I've always been around women who have been strong-willed and all that. So for me, it just seems the norm. Now that's not going to be true of everybody, but for me it was. So it was like how she's written like that makes sense, especially when you're looking at it in a time period where women being this independent would have been looked at like, eh, which is part of the point of the song where the whole town is actively judging her. So it makes her stand out a bit. But it also adds a little bit to her romance with the Beast, and the fact that they're both outcasts in a way. She is because she's acting different than the societal norm says that someone of her gender is supposed to be acting for the time. And Beast because he is a literal physical outcast, even though his social station would say otherwise. Now, I haven't talked about the synopsis. The synopsis is, it begins giving the Beast backstory. He was a prince that was spoiled, selfish, and unkind. One night, an old woman came to the castle asking for shelter. He was like, yeah, no, get out of here. Now, he messes with the wrong person with this because her ugliness melts away and she reveals herself to be a beautiful enchantress. Now, maybe this is my more modern and older mindset looking at this, but I'm starting to wonder if she's supposed to be like a Fae sorceress. Because, you know, they say don't anger the Fae. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what she's supposed to be, but they never comment on it. Either way, she turns the Beast into the Beast as punishment for his actions. And everyone in the castle also suffers. They're turned into various objects. I mean, Lumiere, Cogsworth, and Mrs. Potts are main three. They're turned into a candelabra, a clock, and a teapot, respectively. And of course, the Beast hates the fact that he's transformed into this, so he keeps himself outside the castle, and he destroys a lot of crap. Like, we see that his portrait of himself, he destroys it. Later on, when Belle's going through the castle, we see he smashes a bunch of mirrors. He destroys a lot of his rooms, so he's really lashing out at this, and he's falling into despair as the narration goes. Now, like any curses, there is the way to break it. Now, part of it ties in wonderfully with this, and that is that he has to learn to love somebody. So, the thing that got him into that boat in the first place, but also someone has to love him in return. Now, given his physical predicament, you can kind of see why that's going to be a little difficult. And that's also part of why he falls into despair, is because, as the narration says, who could ever learn to love a beast? Now, it jumps ahead almost 10 years later, which that also makes it a little weird, because like, wait a minute, if it goes to his 21st birthday, and it's been about 10 years, that means he did the curse when he was 11? Dang, that's fake. Then again, Fae sorceress, they don't really care, if you look at it that way. Now we jump ahead to the modern part of the film, or modern, I should say, the present day, probably a better term. And we meet Belle. She lives in a village with her father. She's going into the village, and it's a quiet village, same stuff day after day. And she borrows a book, and it's actually given to her. And this is where we're introduced to a lot of our side characters that don't really have names, and of course our villain, Gaston, a hunter character archetype, who in most other fairy tale films would probably be the hero, because he's the big, strong, dashing, good-looking man with a gun. But here, he's the villain, which makes it a nice little contrast between him and the Beast, which I'll get to in a bit. His sidekick, LeFou, the comic relief side character. And Gaston wants to marry Belle, which leads into part of his motivation. She doesn't want anything to do with it. We see her father, who is eccentric as well, which is a nice little hand-in-hand thing with Belle, because Belle stands out for a time period, and of course her father stands out because he's an eccentric inventor that nobody really likes, but they tolerate him. He decides he's going to go to the fair with his invention after Belle, he's like, yeah, Dad, you got this. And he got it. He gets lost. He loses his horse in the invention, and he winds up at the Beast Castle after being chased by wolves. Now, he gets brought in by Lumiere, and everyone's welcoming him except for the Beast, and the Beast throws him in his dungeon. Now, just to bring up the original fairy tale and a little bit of Cocteau's version of it here, in those versions of it, the Beast doesn't threaten to throw him into the dungeon until he tries to steal one of his roses. Because he's like, I give you food, I give you shelter, and this is how you repay me. Whereas here, the Beast is just a dick about it. It's just the fact he dared trespass into his castle, and the fact he thinks he's staring at him like, so you come to stare at the Beast. Really playing on his insecurities about his appearance there. And he throws him in the dungeon. Now, one thing I got to comment on with this scene, and also when Belle first meets the Beast, is that the Beast is all in shadows. I mean, even when we first see him in the opening thing, he's in shadows. So we get a vague outline of what he looks like, but we don't see him clearly until later. And I love how he really is in shadows when he first steps into the room here. And it looks like something dark and menacing. And combine it with Benson's vocal performance. Oh, yeah. And how the lower growls of it. Now, Belle finds out that her father is in danger, and this, of course, is after Gaston makes his intent to marry Belle clear, and she rejects him. And he's like, yeah, I'm not going to take no for an answer. Remember the whole thing about misogyny? That goes in there. She can't express her agency without the man who wants to pursue her being like, no, I deserve this. Now, Belle ends up at the castle. She meets the Beast, and we see him illuminated for the first time. She agrees to switch places with her father. Her father gets sent back to the village, and she stays there. Now, at this point, a lot of the side characters have seen she could possibly be the one who could break this spell. And of course, the Beast has kind of thought of that a little bit, but he's still like, yeah. And I think the line that really sums that up is like, she's so beautiful, and, well, look at me. Which, that really kind of sums up their romantic relationship here, is that it's about seeing beyond the physical part of it and seeing the personality. Which, I guess you could say also pops up again in another film these two direct, in the Hunchback of Notre Dame one. That one, though, the romance one, doesn't really pop up until the sequel, at least for Quasimodo, but the not judging by appearances thing definitely pops up again, so that's definitely a theme of theirs. Now, as you could kind of guess, the romance does not go well at first, because the Beast is really demanding, I thought I told you to come down to dinner! And she doesn't acquiesce, and of course the Beast makes an ass out of himself a couple times, and one of them even, Belle leaves the castle and gets attacked by the wolves, and that's this scene where he defends her, and, her helping him get back to the castle and helping with his wounds starts to lead to their bonding. Beast starts to come out of his shell. Now, the fact that he protected her, Belle starts to see there isn't more to this Beast than just how he is. Now, part of this is also, when she sneaks into the West Wing, which is his room, she sees the portrait of him. Now, even though we saw it in the opening scene when it got slashed, when she puts the things back up, we don't see what she sees. But based on how she acts at the end of the film, through the visuals, you could see that she's thinking, like, is this what he really looks like? I think mainly because of how his eyes are. Because you look at the portrait and how prominently blue his eyes are there. Even as a beast, his eyes are very blue. And when he turns back into a human, spoiler, that's one of the few things that really are prominent in his character design, is his eyes. And you know what they always say, the eyes are the window to the soul. But all this is where you can start to see the blossoming of their relationship. Now, it doesn't really give a full accurate account of how long they're there. I'd say probably at least a couple weeks. It is enough for a relationship to blossom. And this is part of the reason I say it's a little bit more believable and strong than it is in Little Mermaid. Little Mermaid, you had 3 days. And while it was believable due to performances, you're like, yeah, not really enough for love. You could make the same argument here. But at least with a couple weeks, you can kind of see the believability a bit more. Especially with how they built it up, and of course how Paige O'Hara and Robbie Benson, their vocal performances combined with the animation and the story writing. It definitely, you can feel the strength of it. And of course, when it gets to the scene where, you know, look, you think it's going to be confession, but it doesn't get confessed right away. You can really feel the romantic tension there. It's unsaid, even though Beast does confess it to his servants, you know, I let her go. But why? I love her. Then, of course, the ending scene, which I'll get to later on when I talk about that, but just the heart, you feel it there. Now, using Gaston as a villain in this piece is a perfect little addition for it. Like I mentioned earlier, it's hard to imagine this story working without a villain. And having Gaston as a character he is be the villain is perfect. And not only did I mention, you know, he looks amazing, he's the hunter archetype. Him being a physically imposing and handsome specimen is a nice little contract with the Beast. Because we got one character that looks ugly, but does have inner goodness. And another character looks good, but is ugly on the inside. Like I mentioned a couple times, he is a misogynist, and that's because of how he behaves towards Belle. Like, as she mentions at one point, I'm not surprised to be won. No, wait a minute, that's Jasmine. But it's the same thing. She's not a prize to be won. And of course, you know, his little wife, that whole thing in her song. In any other type of movie, as many have said, Gaston would probably be the hero of the piece. I mean, he's the type of character that would shoot beasts, stop big bad wolves from killing grandmothers and Little Red Riding Hoods. It would come to the rescue with his group of dogs, being like, I'm here to save the day. Not in this film. They kind of subvert the expectation a little bit there by making the character you think is going to be the hero be the villain. And what adds to it is that as the film goes on, there's like little subtle changes in the way Gaston is drawn, or where you can see he's starting to go off the deep end. And you start to see a little bit of that inner ugliness seek outward. And of course, this leads to the on the nose but apt moment where Belle's like, he's not the monster, Gaston, you are. And of course, he does get a good comeuppance. Traditional Disney death, falling to their death. But he almost kind of wins if it wasn't for love. So I guess you could say in a way that love conquers all is in here. Oh, if that isn't clear enough, the spell is broken in the end. And this is one of the ways I say that, another way that this kind of perfects the classical Disney formula, not only with the romance being more believable, but the happy ending. Because you think at first it's going to be a sad one, because Gaston does stab the Beast in the side, and if you look at where he gets stabbed, oh yeah, he got him in something vital, and he does technically die for at least a minute. But it is Belle, her confessing her feelings for it. Like I mentioned, it is a couple weeks, but enough for this to be believable. And the romantic tension before she says it, you can really tell in O'Hara's vocal performance that this is underneath the surface. I mean, even before she left, it was there. But definitely when he's about to go, that's when it comes to the surface. And just the way she says the words, I love you, the way she performs it, it's one of those things that really tugs at the heartstrings. And I'm going to admit, even with how many times I've seen this film as a kid, just watching it again for this review, it actually brought some tears to my eyes, just watching it. Combined with the animation and all that. And then the music, which this is the music by Menken, when he starts to transform back and all the visuals, it's still one of those moments. If I were to do a list of top 10 Disney moments from their animated films, this in transformation scene would be on there. Just the way everything plays out. Now, I've always noticed the animation on the Beast, and of course when it cuts away the animation on the 3. One thing I looked at closely while watching this time is the animation they did on Belle for it. And it really does play it. She's watching like, what in the world is going on? And then of course he transforms back, and he's alive again. Like I said, he was dead for a minute or two. And now of course they get their happy ending and they finally kiss. Because earlier, when he's still a beast, you can see there are a couple moments where they might, but that's part of the whole romantic tension part, because a lot of the other story beats kind of interrupt them. So then finally kissing at the end, like I said, love conquers all. Another way that this film takes what they started with Little Mermaid and pushes it forward is the Broadway into Disney vibe that I mentioned in that one with the musical numbers. Because you definitely feel it here, not only with how bombastic the music and the lyrics are, but also the vocal performances and the accompanying animation. And of course, like The Little Mermaid, just about every song here is a banger. I mean, think about it. The opening number really sets the stage for the world that Belle lives in, her place in it, and of course Gaston and what his motivation is. Of course, the villain song Gaston definitely has a more bar aesthetic with it musically, but it fits the character of Gaston, and of course it's just him all bragging. I love the use of wording. I mean, like when they mention spitting, and he's like, I'm especially good at expectorating. I actually had to Google what that word means. It's just a fancy way for saying spitting, which is a nice little way to use some vocabulary in there, even though some people go, that's a college word. Hey, it fits. Also kind of shows that Gaston likes throwing around words to show he's smarter than he actually is. And of course, Be Our Guest, Jerry Orbach's song in here. Perfect way to show all of the Beast servants really welcoming Belle into the castle and trying to nudge her towards the romance. And of course, the only song that Beast sings on in the whole film, Something There, which is kind of a duet. It's like a group duet. And of course, Beauty and the Beast, the titular song, sung in film by Angela Lansbury, which the fun thing about that is that she did not want to sing it. Not that she didn't want to sing in the film, but she thought another character would be better suited to sing it. Thankfully, Wise and Trousdale managed to talk her into doing a recording as a backup in case another character fell through. And that one recording is what's in the film. Which, listening to it again, I'm like, you can kind of tell, but I think her more subdued vocals on it and just a nice, pleasant melody they do works for the in-movie version. And of course, they did the pop version with Celine Dion doing the female one on the end credits, which I believe this is the film that started that tradition of them doing a pop version of one of the songs. Because about every single Disney film I could think of after this had one. Because Aladdin, let's see, they had Whole New World. Pocahontas, they had one for a film, for a movie, for a song, if I could talk, that was actually cut out of the film, and that was If I Never Knew You. I'll talk about that when I get to Pocahontas. I think the one that they did for Hunchback was cut from the film too. I gotta look up that. Of course, Mulan, they have Reflection. For Hercules, they had I Can Go the Distance. And like Tarzan's its own unique entity. I'll talk about that when I get to it. And even nowadays, they still do it. But I think they kind of lost a little bit of their magic when it comes to adapting them from the in-movie one to the post-credits one. Because every time I've listened to some of them, I'm like, yeah, I can't get jiggy with this. Like the version of Let It Go for the credits, I'm like, oh yeah, no, I don't feel this. It doesn't have any soul. Let's see, Beauty and the Beast. What's the fun thing about that is when that film got nominated at the Oscars, instead of just having the in-credits version, they did an amalgamation and had all three up there singing. And what made it beautiful is at the ending part, all three of them, their voices go together beautifully. And I'm like... of course, Gaston's riot song at the end. That's also an excellent song, kind of like a secondary villain number. If there's any flaw when it comes to the songs, is the fact that the Beast does not have a solo number. Which I'm glad that not only did the live action remake kind of rectify that, even though there you could be like, this is our give us an Oscar song, but the Broadway musical rectified that. Technically, he has 3 solo numbers. He has a long solo number, and then he has his 2 little brief ones. One of them being a brief one, and then, of course, a reprise. So they definitely rectified that. Now, considering the little dark notes they add to his voice, I can kind of see why they decided not to, because the one time you hear him sing, it's his inner voice and it's more normal. But still, it would have been nice to see, and but I put that more as a nitpick than an actual complaint. I already talked about the animation for the most part being beautiful. I mean, a couple of moments are like, okay, they kind of keep it a little bit there. But one thing I love, and I already kind of hinted at this, is how the Beast is designed. You can definitely see it's influenced by the Cocteau version, which a lot of the stuff in this film is. But Glenn Keane, who was the supervising animator for the Beast, you could definitely tell he created a hybrid chimera. You know, he took a mane of a lion, took a beard, head structure of a buffalo, stuff from a wild boar, a gorilla, tail of a wolf, big bulky body of a bear. And then, of course, like I mentioned, the blue eyes. That's the one little bit of humanity they left there. So I like that. It makes it a little bit easier for the audience to connect with them if there's still some humanity there. And then, of course, as the romance goes, it also makes it a little bit more believable. And, of course, I haven't really talked about the side characters. I mean, Lumiere, he's a little bit of comic relief there, because, you know, he is the stereotypical French character. But Orbach plays in a way to where you really do like him. Which, funny enough, he is the only character in the film with a French accent. And of course, Cogwork's the stuck-up nobility servant guy where he's there. You can imagine that if he actually was a normal human, he'd be walking around like this a little bit. And he kind of has that vibe when we see him as a human. Whereas Mrs. Potts, Angela Lansbury personified, is the best way to describe her character. And I'd say that's a bad thing, but you can definitely tell that they wrote this character specifically for Lambert. Excuse me. And then all the other side characters, they do what they have to do there. I mean, we got the wardrobe character, got the chef character, got the little dog thing. I mean, they're all just there in the background, but they suit their purpose for what there is. And then, of course, there's the maid character that is Lumiere's love interest, and there's a couple funny moments there. Of course, LeFou being Gaston's sidekick. He's basically there for comic relief and be the brunt of his physical hits and all that. And, of course, be his wingman and his hype man at points. And then, of course, the rest of the side characters in the town. Each of them stands out a bit. It's not really much different than other Disney designs you would see in films like this. And, of course, interesting to see them in the background scenes, especially how easily they turn on Maurice and Belle at the end of the film. Not really much else to say about the film itself. It's a classic. Like I said, one of my favorite films, not only from this era, but in Disney in general. Definitely a film that if they ever do re-release in theaters again, I do plan on seeing it. Just to see how this looks on the big screen. Because watching it for the first time in HD, because I did watch it on Disney Plus, beautiful. I have it in my collection a couple times. I got the VHS over there somewhere, and then I got the Blu-ray. If I do ever have children, like I mentioned, this is definitely one they're going to see early on. And if I would be so bold, out of all of the fairy tale films that Disney has done, this is their best one. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. Till next time, everybody.